Reporters swarmed Jun calm and composed. He said he had studied with private tutors for a year, and that the cost of his education could cover journalist salaries for 10 years. His father lowered his head in silence. His mother looked uneasy. Jun crossed his arms and asked the reporters a simple question. Did they really believe the grandson of the richest man in the country sat alone grinding textbooks? When they mentioned the student who placed first, a boy from Jeju Island, Jun suggested they go interview him instead. Articles about Jun, he said, should please his grandfather, nothing more. By the end of 1996, champagne flowed at the Sang Hotel. Relatives congratulated Jun, calling him a future prosecutor general. Jun calmly corrected them. Prosecutors are appointed by presidents. He planned to become a corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer. Yanomam, watching closely, realized Jun wasn't trying to compete with him anymore. That made him dangerous. Later that night, Yanomam offered to take Jun somewhere fun. The car drove into a private villa. An employee rushed forward, apologizing. Yanomam exploded, striking him for failing to bring a popular actress. Jun watched silently, reminded of scenes from his past life. When Jun told Yanomam to stop, the room froze. Yanomam forced a smile, dismissed the employee, and pretended nothing happened. Jun saw through it. Power made people ugly when no one was watching. Over drinks, Yanomam spoke about loyalty. Employees, he said, only pretend to be loyal. Blood relatives are different. Brothers share everything. Jun drank quietly, knowing the truth. In his past life, this same cousin sent his own brother to prison over money. Loyalty didn't exist here. Only timing did. The man looked at his cousin kindly, smiled, and said he didn't care whether Jun became a prosecutor or a lawyer. Jun looked at him in surprise. Yanomam grinned and said that if Jun stood on his side and helped him, he would make him the second most powerful person in the entire corporation. Jun pressed his lips together and studied his cousin carefully. Yanomam closed his eyes, shook his head, and said Jun was the only person in the family with real potential. Everyone else was incompetent. Even if they magically matured overnight, they still lacked what it took to run a business. Jun stared at him silently as Yanomam continued, saying Jun was different and that someone with his brain should be used properly. Jun narrowed his eyes. He wasn't sure if Yanomam was trying to control him or genuinely wanted him as an advisor. Before he could answer, someone called Yanomam's name. Two women stood at the doorway, smiling, one of them waving and joking that it felt like forever since their last meeting. Yanomam greeted them cheerfully. Jun recognized them instantly. Celebrities, the kind you see on TV every weekend. Jun stood up, apologized for leaving early, said he was tired and wished them a good time. Yanomam didn't stop him. Jun stepped onto the porch, loosened his tie, inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly. His indifferent expression returned. It was the first time he had really drunk alcohol since his rebirth, and he had nearly overdone it. The cold night air helped. The driver was asleep in the car, a faint bruise still visible on his face. Jun studied him through the glass. When Jun got in, the man woke up in panic, apologizing repeatedly. Jun told him it was fine and apologized instead for making him wait. As the car drove off, Jun rested his head on his hand and asked if the man worked in the strategic planning office. The driver stiffened in shock. Jun calmly explained there were two groups there: elite families who actually planned strategy and the others who ran errands and cleaned up messes. Jun said the driver belonged to the second group. The man's grip tightened on the wheel. Jun told him quietly that he understood that humiliation because he had lived that life once too. Then Jun smiled and said something unexpected. The driver was luckier than those so-called elites. Jun explained that his grandfather was nearly 80. When he was gone, the chairman's children would tear each other apart like animals fighting over meat. Information would become more valuable than loyalty. People would pay fortunes for secrets. In the long run, Someone like the driver could make far more money than the polished fools upstairs. The driver demanded to know why Jun was telling him this. Jun replied calmly that he wasn't his employee, but some truths were worth hearing. Then he closed his eyes, told the man to wake him when they arrived, and casually called him bro. The city lights passed outside as Jun imagined the future. 1997, the steel company collapsed, banks panicked, corporations circled like predators, a feeding frenzy was coming. CEO Yang Chao stared at the paper in his hand, disbelief tightening his face, and quietly repeated the number, 2.37 trillion won. He looked up at the room and asked if the data was correct, but the executives avoided his eyes and stayed silent. His voice sharpened as he demanded an answer, and Yang Gi, adjusting his glasses, finally confirmed that every figure was accurate. Yang Chao looked back at the paper and said that if this was true, then Dehan Group would open bidding around that amount. He added that Dehan had far more experience in steel than Sang, meaning the real question was where they should even start bidding. The room stayed silent, heads lowered, until Yang Chao turned sharply toward his grandson and asked what he thought. Yang Jun met his gaze and answered without hesitation, 1.8 trillion won. Yang Chao's eyes widened as he demanded an explanation, and Yang Jun calmly replied that this was the absolute maximum they could afford. Yang Chao leaned back and said bluntly that if that was the case, then Dehan would win. Yang Jun spread his hands and said there was no point burning everything, because if this became a contest of money alone, they had no chance. Yang Chao tapped his cheek and reminded him this was an open auction, asking what exactly he was proposing. Yang Jun replied that they should emphasize how Siyang acquiring hand steel would benefit the entire economy. He pointed out that Dehan already owned a similar plant, so acquiring another wouldn't change much. Yang Gi watched him closely as Yang Chao crossed his arms and ordered a report explaining the economic impact of Siyang's purchase. He stressed that it needed to be written well enough to move people's hearts and gave them 1 week. Then he asked if everyone agreed on 1.8 trillion or if anyone had another idea. A voice suggested 2.5 trillion won. Yang Gi shot the speaker a hostile look as Yang Chao calmly asked him to explain. The man introduced himself as Zhang Chao, president of Sang Construction, and said the consortium didn't care who acquired hand steel. The government would support whoever won, meaning they would need to pay more to avoid controversy. When Yang Chao asked where the extra money would come from, Zhang Chao waved it off, saying they could use land slated for apartments as collateral and borrow 700 billion won. Yang Chao frowned and asked how they planned to repay that loan without selling apartments. Zhang Chao narrowed his eyes and said he would resolve everything during construction, so the chairman had nothing to worry about. Yang Chao studied him and realized this answer came closest to reality. Zhang Chao had offered a solution and taken full responsibility, leaving the chairman clean if things went wrong. Smiling slightly, Yang Chao joked about how casually Zhang Chao talked about 700 billion, asking how much he'd already embezzled. Zhang Chao hurriedly denied it as the meeting dissolved. Later, reviewing documents, Yang Chao said Dehan was expected to bid 3 trillion won and scoffed that their CEO wasn't the type to bluff. When asked if he truly planned to invest 2.5 trillion, he questioned why it mattered. The secretary admitted that doing so would limit the fund for some time. Yang Chao smiled and asked Dijun what he thought, finding him calmly reading at the table. Yang Chao asked if simply offering more money was their only option. Dijun smiled and asked for a hint, already knowing his grandfather wasn't easy to read. Closing his eyes, Yang Chao said that if he owned a sapling, he'd sell it to someone who would grow it, not someone who'd cut it down for firewood. Business worked the same way. The secretary broke into a sweat and asked if Dehan really planned to resell the company. Yang Chao replied that it didn't matter, as long as the seller believed that story. Dijun finally spoke, explaining that Dihan would build apartments on the land, sell the equipment overseas, and erase the company quietly. If Siyang acquired it, they would at least appear to restore it. Yang Chao smiled, saying he might have given too obvious a hint. Dijun considered Dihan's connections and realized approval wouldn't be difficult if dismantling was the plan. When asked how much he intended to invest, Yang Chao admitted that 1.8 trillion was the limit. Haki warned that the 500 billion gap was massive. Yang Chao closed his eyes and said all they needed was to plant seeds, and he'd turn them into rumors. Dijun immediately understood, imagining headlines, protests, and pressure. Yang Chao ordered him to closely observe how he used government allies. Then his tone softened, reminding Dijun that orientation started tomorrow and advising him to build loyalty early. Dijun closed his book, said he understood, and was told a capable man was waiting outside to follow his instructions. Smiling, he thanked his grandfather and headed out. Outside, lights still burned in the windows as a man by the car bowed and handed him a card. He introduced himself as Yunyo, assistant head of group strategy, and offered him a ride home. The car moved through the streets as Dijun stared out the window. When he asked who had assigned Yunyo, assuming the vice chairman, Yunyo replied that it was Chief Haki. Dijun pictured Haki, his grandfather's closest aide, and asked who the reports would go to. Yunyo said everything went directly to Haki. Dijun smiled and told him to report everything exactly as it happened, since following Haki's orders was his job. Yunyo stayed silent as the car continued forward. As sunlight hit the brick cottages, Dijun mentioned Hand Steel again, saying he hoped they'd get involved. Sean frowned, saying it wasn't really their game. Sean explained that even if they acquired it, liquidation was inevitable and selling would take years. Dijun smiled and said that wasn't the goal. He wasn't trying to buy it, just raise the stakes and leave. Sean frowned harder, warning him about the clash between Dihan and Sang. Dijun looked at him and said plainly that he was helping his grandfather and wanted Siyang to win. Sean sighed, reminding him that as CEO, he had to obey the main shareholder. He then asked the real question, "What exactly do you want?" The answer aired on the news instead of in words. An American investment fund announced it had entered the race, offering 2.5 trillion won for Hand Steel. Standing before reporters, Sean leaned forward calmly, saying companies come and go and steel mills aren't sentimental assets. His fund had calculated the value and was confident it would win. When asked what fantasy investment would do if they succeeded, Sean replied without hesitation that they were investors, not builders. The plant would be sold to someone more capable, and the land would go to construction. A reporter asked whether this was speculation despite the risk. Sean took a sip of water and said that wasn't the right word, adding that the bank should simply choose the highest bidder, especially when even banks were vulnerable. The screen went dark as someone threw the remote onto the table. Hack closed his eyes, rubbing his temple, saying interference without consequences wasn't acceptable. Sean narrowed his eyes, irritated that such a trivial issue had forced an early meeting. The man snapped back, pointing out that this little performance had clearly shaken someone they both knew. Yonel trembled with anger, ordering the secretary to bring Sean in immediately. Sean stood up calmly, saying the chairman should rewatch the interview, because he and his grandson had thought this through carefully. He admitted Siyang would gain an advantage and might spend more than planned, but now the consortium would be easier to convince. With that, he excused himself, heading to a creditors' meeting. When the door closed, the secretary froze, finally realizing which grandson Sean meant. Haki tilted his head, understanding that this intervention could shift public opinion exactly where they needed it. He laughed at himself for missing it earlier just as the phone rang. Chairman Yang Chao said he'd reconsidered, and that Sean's interference could be useful after all. Hackey confirmed that he'd spoken with the fund's head and that it was Dijun's idea, even if Sean refined the execution. Yang Chao was stunned, then laughed, realizing his grandson had pulled an American investment fund into his corner, explaining that tomorrow the media attack would begin, harsh articles criticizing fantasy investment. He planned to flood television discussions with economics professors emphasizing that Dehan already owned a steel mill. The narrative would be simple. Dehan didn't need hand steel to run it, only to strip the land. Hackey smiled, confident this would poison public opinion. Yang Chao praised his timing as perfect. Dijun walked in with his hands in his pockets, noticing the banners, beer bottles, and long tables packed with people. He paused at the entrance as heads turned, some whispering about his looks, before taking a seat among food and drinks. He smiled, thinking that without knowing the future, this would feel painfully awkward. A student council member welcomed everyone, followed by law professors. Then freshman introductions began. One student shouted his name proudly, another declared himself the future guardian of justice. Dijun listened with a grin as applause echoed. When the microphone reached him, the room fell silent. He asked for a little extra time, bowed politely, and introduced himself as Dijun, joking that he should probably thank his rich grandfather for getting in. Some laughed, others didn't, because they knew money alone couldn't buy admission here. Still smiling, he said he wasn't good at making friends, so he preferred gifts. He asked if gifts counted as bribery. The answer came calmly. Friendship was too abstract to count. He followed up by asking about professors, earning laughter when one admitted grades were much more concrete. That's when the doors opened. Men in black suits rolled in boxes as murmurs spread. Dijun smiled and said his grandfather taught him that gifts should exceed expectations. Boxes were handed out, revealing brand new laptops. No one was listening anymore. Later, sitting beside his grandfather, Dijun casually calculated the cost, around 600 million won. Yang Chao stared at him in disbelief. Dijun smiled and said every one of those students would now be on his side, and that it doubled as perfect product promotion. When told student popularity wasn't enough, Dijun said this was only the beginning. He explained discounts, campus ads, and prestige branding. Yang Chao sipped his tea, considering it. Dijun warned that if his grandfather wasn't interested, he could handle the expense himself. Yang Chao snapped at him not to make him look like a stingy old man. After calming down, Yang Chao asked why only 200 laptops were prepared when there were 400 law students. Dijun smiled and explained that only half usually showed up for orientation. He said it was fair to reward initiative. Yang Chao laughed, slapping his knee, saying it was far easier to motivate people by rewarding them openly. Students sat around chatting. Someone hugged his laptop box and joked that it would be his teddy bear for the night. Some had already unboxed theirs and were exploring it. Someone slipped him a folded note. Yunio whispered that these were the names of students who refused the gift. Dijun smiled, thinking those people would need closer attention. Campus life moved on as April warmed the air. Dijun chatted with classmates, quickly forming a small circle of close associates. In class, students greeted him warmly. One joked that the laptop was so good he couldn't study anymore. Dijun laughed and said that was part of the plan, distracting his rivals. A few students without laptops watched him carefully, sweat running down their faces. Dijun noticed their stares and briefly wondered if another distribution in May would be necessary. At the coffee machine, Dijun watched a student with glasses who had refused the laptop. He dropped a coin into the machine and casually asked if the guy had attended orientation. The student snapped back, saying Dijun couldn't expect gratitude. Dijun smiled and said he never expected it, assuming the refusal came from pride. Accused him of showing off his wealth in front of professors. Dijun calmly asked whether refusing a free lunch or coffee would also count as pride. The student argued it wasn't the same. Dijun replied that it was exactly the same, only scaled differently. He explained that while others counted money in thousands, he counted in millions and billions. For him, a laptop and a coffee cost roughly the same. The student clenched his fists in rage. Dijun added that people happily accept small favors but suddenly discover pride when the gift is expensive. He tossed his cup into the trash and walked away, leaving the student watching silently. Later, sitting on a bench under the sun, Dijun listened to his friends and rubbed his neck, disappointed that every student who refused the gift reacted the same way. As he stood, a fair-haired guy in a tracksuit approached him and bluntly said that even if seniors claimed it wasn't a bribe, that was exactly what it was. Dijun's eyes widened in surprise because this man's name was also on the list. He asked calmly why he thought it was a bribe, and the student sat beside him on the bench, explaining that bribes are paid in advance while gifts are given as thanks for services already rendered. Dijun reminded him that he wasn't a government official and hadn't been asked for anything. The student smiled and said bribes are often given years before the favor is ever requested. Dijun narrowed his eyes, snorted softly, and watched a bead of sweat roll down the man's face. The student asked whether his grandfather taught him tricks like this. Dijun replied that being the youngest meant the chairman rarely paid attention to him, but his older cousins taught him plenty of useful things. The fair-haired guy studied him and suggested that Dijun must be the least successful member of the Sang group family. Dijun didn't argue, smiling as he said his father, the chairman's youngest son, had been expelled long ago and now produced films. Scratching his head, the student admitted he should have taken the laptop. Dijun thought the guy was oddly amusing. The student asked whether he could still get one or if it was too late. Dijun realized he didn't really want it and was just being polite, which made him smile. He asked if the guy was older than most freshmen. The student bristled, said he didn't look that old, and accused Dijun of insulting him. Dijun offered the laptop as an apology. The student stood, brushed himself off and said maybe someday, then walked away. Dijun called after him, reminding him he never answered the age question. The student raised a hand in an obscene gesture and told him to shut up. Nearby, Dijun noticed a girl chatting quietly with someone. She looked familiar, and his friend adjusted his glasses, warning him not to try anything. He realized he hadn't seen her at orientation and learned she'd quietly left during the laptop chaos. Dijun smiled, suddenly stood up and walked over. The girl noticed him approaching and looked up curiously. Dijun said he was curious why she didn't take the laptop gift. She smiled, closed her eyes, and said she didn't know how to use it, wondering what the point was of accepting something useless to her. Dijun looked down awkwardly, realizing he'd never considered that reason. She teased him gently, saying his stare made her heart flutter. Dijun blushed despite himself. Elsewhere, Yangchao crossed his arms as a woman joked about finally finding someone normal. She quickly corrected herself, saying this was the future chairman's match. She laid out 3 candidates, including the daughter of the president of Deal Bank, a Princeton graduate working in Hong Kong. Yangchao studied the photos silently. She explained that another candidate was the granddaughter of the Hansung newspaper chairman. Yangchao told her to arrange meetings with all 3. He warned her not to let rumors spread about choosing a bride like shopping. She protested that finding candidates at this level wasn't easy. For your grandson Dajun, she mentioned the final candidate, the granddaughter of a constitutional court appointee from a powerful legal family. Yangchao grew thoughtful as she added that the girl studied at the same university as his grandson. The woman smiled, saying she'd arrange everything naturally so it felt like fate. Yangchao told her to begin. Later Yongjin learned he'd be meeting candidates the next day. He frowned, realizing marriage wasn't something he could influence. Yonggi explained, calmly, that marriage was the best form of collateral and security. Yongjin clenched his teeth, understanding the logic even if he hated it. In class, a professor announced a new group assignment based on controversial public incidents. Students groaned as groups of 5 were assigned. Dijun scanned the list and froze when he saw Mion's name in his group. They exchanged brief looks before class began. He quietly handed the paper to Assistant Kim, asking him to look into 2 names. Kim asked if he should report it to Haki. Dijun told him it was his choice. Kim agreed, clearly testing boundaries. Later, news played showing bids for hand steel. When Sang Group was announced as the winner, Yang Chao simply smiled. Others celebrated, relieved they hadn't lost much. Someone complained about fantasy investment making them look like villains. Chao replied that this was better, since it gave judges a reason to exclude them. Investigations into the fund revealed nothing obvious, though its CEO, being Korean, raised questions. Yang Chao ordered them to uncover the investor's identity quickly. The man nodded calmly, promising it would be done. Yonel grinned and said it was time to start the game. A folder landed on the table, showing what would have happened in 1991 if the corruption had never been reported. Another folder followed, revealing that Ain Motors would have been absorbed into Siyang Motors. The documents explained Chairman Jin's original strategy, restructuring the domestic auto industry with full government support. Yonel remarked calmly that Sang had simply been unlucky. They had the plan, but history chose someone else. He smirked and imagined the man who had wanted Ain Motors for years, probably tearing his hair out watching it slip away again, maybe even losing his mind over it. Then Yonel smiled wider, pointing out that all the money the old man had scraped together and borrowed was now tied up in buying a steel mill. Laughter spread across the room. Yonel ended it firmly, ordering everyone to begin tomorrow. Elsewhere, a man holding a mug asked what Chairman Hong had been up to, nodding that several days had passed since the official meeting. Hong smiled and congratulated him on acquiring hand steel. The man closed his eyes and asked if congratulations were really necessary, since the vice chairman and Yongan had handled everything. Hong lowered his head and added that he'd heard the chairman had recently studied business abroad and already taken on something this big. Then Hong hesitated and reported that strange rumors were spreading. News about Ain Motors had suddenly started appearing again, exactly like 6 years ago. The gray-haired man froze and slammed his mug down, asking if someone was targeting the company. Hong admitted it wasn't confirmed, but the similarities were too obvious to ignore. When asked about Hansung Daily, Hong replied that their exit had already been blocked. The man stayed silent, put away his phone, and asked for a bottle of water. A nervous girl brought a tray, flinching when he snapped that he asked for a bottle, not a glass. He drained it quickly, slammed it down, and waved her away. Frowning, he asked if Hong could delay the articles. Hong agreed calmly, joking that there hadn't even been a wedding yet and favors were already being requested. Hong promised his reporters would try their best, smiling as he imagined tripping up Dehan Group. He looked satisfied, already picturing Chairman Jin taking care of his eldest granddaughter. In another building, a man entered and asked if there was news from Uito about Ain Motors. Jae-jun looked at him over his drink. Sean wondered aloud whether he even had time for university when the country was this unstable. He asked if he was worried about the Southeast Asian financial crisis or planning to exchange regional currency for dollars. Dijun asked why he would do that. Sean believed the crisis was inevitable. Smirking, Dijun hinted that Southeast Asia was already hell. By April, 4 Korean conglomerates had collapsed, while the Asian dragons were still standing tall. Sean frowned when asked whether preparing for a typhoon was really so wrong. He closed his eyes, realizing Dijun was closely tracking global financial flows. Sean revealed rumors that Dehan was targeting Ain Motors. Its finances were already at rock bottom, and a little pressure would suffocate it completely. Dijun realized history hadn't changed. 6 years ago, his grandfather failed to take Ain Motors, and now the same moment had returned. This time, he decided, the outcome had to change. He asked about the takeover directly, surprising Sean. News spread that the story would be framed as a foreign investment success through fantasy investment. Dijun frowned and stated firmly that it would be their company, not outsiders, that did this. At Siyang reviewed documents, reporting that Dihan's chairman was using the exact same strategy Siyang had designed 6 years earlier. They fell silent. Dihan had gotten hand steel, but it drained their funds. Ain Motors was now too expensive. When asked if this was part of the plan, Yao crossed his arms and said there was nothing they could do now. If Dihan took Ain Motors, Siyang's market share would collapse. Yao demanded action by tomorrow. After the room emptied, Haki asked whether they should sell the 7% stake in Ain Motors held under other names. Yao snapped, accusing him of surrender. Haki replied calmly that if Dihan took control, Ain Motors would go bankrupt anyway. Yao clenched his teeth, saying that without the corruption incident 6 years ago, Ain Motors would already be theirs. He suggested using the shares to stir trouble. Haki said the shares were scattered and needed someone to unify them. When Sean's name came up, the secretary froze. Yao ordered him to give Sean the shares and make him their representative. They also had a reserve fund. This was their chance to pull him back. Haki considered exchanging Fantasy's 100 billion won fund for the 7% stake and smiled, realizing the chairman's instincts were still sharp. Later, Sean leaned against a sofa as Yao explained everything. Dijun noticed how furious his grandfather really was. Yao said he wanted to use the 7% stake to shake the situation by throwing Sean into the front line. He reminded him that Fantasy still had dirty funds available. Sean hesitated, saying there was no reason to buy a company destined to fail. Dijun frowned, sensing there was more left unsaid. Sean finally asked if Dijun truly wanted Ain Motors. Dijun confirmed it calmly. Sean warned him that acquiring Ain Motors meant acquiring the entire Ain Group, worth over 14 trillion won. When asked what he would do next, Dijun stayed quiet. Sean said rationally they should shut down branches, scrap what was useless, and sell the rest at cost. Dijun smiled, saying valuable things should be sold at a higher price. Sean replied that they should sell it to whoever paid even slightly more. Dijun thought that answer sounded exactly like a gambler's logic. Sean smiled and suggested saving Ain Motors properly, cutting away the rot first, then applying medicine and feeding it nutrients. Dijun looked pleased and asked what came after that. Sean scratched the back of his head, admitting he wasn't confident he could control a massive conglomerate even if they succeeded. Dijun calmly told him to reach that point first and worry about control later. Closing his eyes, Sean said the real issue was simple. Even if they rushed into the takeover, the odds of winning were close to zero. Dijun smiled and asked why Sean suddenly sounded cautious, reminding him that he'd never been afraid of low odds before. Sean clenched his fist and explained that if Chairman Jin's 7% stake ended up with them, they could finally see inside the company. He reminded Dijun that his grandfather was Chairman Jin himself. Dijun realized that without Siyang's influence, everything would become far harder. Sean said Dijun had enough money to buy Ain Motors, but auctions weren't enough. Power mattered more. Dijun thought for a moment and said they needed someone who could influence judges, creditors, and the government. Sean looked at him like a kid asking for a toy. Dijun said okay. Sean smiled and laid it out clearly. 28 subsidiaries, over 50,000 executives, and a total value exceeding 14 trillion won. Whoever won this fight wouldn't just win a company, they'd win everything. This wasn't a war with bullets, it was a war with money, and losses killed just as effectively. Sean said he'd meet manager Haki. Dijun smiled and said he'd speak with the Siyang chairman. Both knew the game had begun. Later, holding a milk carton, Dijun was asked why he kept skipping school. He said he planned to enroll, not suffer, and wanted to rest a little. His grandfather called him out, saying Dajun went to Miracle Investment every morning instead of studying. Dijun replied calmly that he was relaxed and noticed Yunek working harder than ever. The old man complained that Dijun might get expelled, forcing him to donate through the Siyang Scholarship Fund. He asked why he was paying more for attendance problems than tuition. Dijun said spending money on education was always good, even though he never planned to study that long. His grandfather had intervened, and now he'd have to manage both school and business. When asked what he actually did in Miracle Investment, Dijun said he was learning things like discussing Ain Motors. His grandfather froze. Dijun explained that Ain Motors was heading toward bankruptcy. The financial sector had turned its back, and Wang Motors' propaganda had finished the job. He said they must have run out of liquid assets, otherwise Dehan wouldn't suddenly apply pressure. His grandfather asked what would happen next. Dijun answered calmly that someone would take Ain Motors quickly and forcefully, just like Han Steel. Chairman Jin smiled, scoring his answer 80 out of 100. When asked why not full marks, because you did not mention who would take ownership. Dijun said because it wasn't clear who would take it yet. Dehan had done this before, hiding its true goal until the final moment. The chairman wondered who else might want Ain Motors. Dijun knew he was referring to the Southeast Asian currency crisis. The old man said many conglomerates were already bankrupt, while the rest were hoarding cash. Dijun asked if he had a secret weapon. Chairman Jin said the buyer would need power equal to Sang or Dehan, and he was out of money. Dijun calmly offered himself as that weapon. The room froze. Dijun repeated that he could take over Ain Group. The chairman stared in astonishment, studying the young man carefully. Dijun panicked for a second, worrying his grandfather might faint, and quickly asked if he was okay. The old man waved it off, saying he was just surprised, then awkwardly steered the conversation back, asking him to repeat what he had said earlier. Dijun didn't hesitate and calmly stated that he could take over the Ink Group. At that, the grandfather bit his lip and scratched the back of his head. Dijun immediately jumped up in worry, asking if everything was fine and where his pills were. The chairman shut him down calmly, telling him to stop shouting and that he wasn't old enough to be popping pills yet. Chairman Jin then told his grandson not to joke around and said that to celebrate entering university, he didn't want a car but Ain Motors instead. Dijun replied without missing a beat that he would buy it with his own money. The grandfather frowned and asked how much he thought it would take to buy the company back. Dijun seriously countered, asking how much the chairman himself would pay if he were in his place. The chairman paused, thinking it over, then decided not to answer. In that moment, he suddenly understood and burst out laughing, calling his grandson an impudent brat. Dijun grinned, realizing his grandfather had caught on. He had asked that question first for a reason. Before making a move, a true leader must hear the opinion of his rival. That was a lesson his grandfather himself had taught him. Dijun's expression hardened, then softened into a confident smile. The chairman ordered him to speak first, reminding him that he was still in charge and that his grandson was trying to play tricks right under his nose. Dijun estimated Ain Motors at 15 trillion won, admitting it was rough without full analysis. Dijun noticed his grandfather wasn't worried about the numbers, but about what it implied. When Dijun casually admitted he had more cash reserves than Sang Group, he smiles and asks whether he should be surprised that his grandson is rich or if the boy wants to be praised. He thought his grandfather would be shocked that he personally surpassed the largest conglomerate in the business world. The chairman only smiles. He raises his hand and says he understands. He says this impudent brat probably just wants to show off, but to ransom Ain Motors he would need at least that much. The young man freezes in surprise. The grandfather admits he was amazed when the boy said he wanted to take over Ain. Chairman Jin's expression turns firm. He says he will not argue. He is curious where his grandson got that much money, but curiosity does not matter. Ain Motors does. The boy realizes his grandfather is clearly suppressing his curiosity, yet he says it does not matter. Images of the company building appear as it's explained that countless problems occur inside the Sang group every single day, yet they remain at the top. This is because they know how to prioritize. Dulling curiosity is a daily necessity. The young man becomes serious and asks what price his grandfather expects. He realizes he too must push curiosity aside and ask what truly matters. Arms crossed, the chairman confidently says he has no idea. He sighs and admits he never planned to buy Ain Motors, so he never checked. But the price is surely very different from 6 years ago. The young man awkwardly asks if his grandfather will help him. Covering his eyes, the old man asks why he even needs Ain Motors and whether it benefits the Saying group at all. The boy falls silent. The grandfather grows serious. The young man wonders whether he is thinking like a loving grandfather or like the chairman who built an empire with his own hands. Then the chairman proposes an option. He suggests that his grandson becomes the owner of Ain Motors and works with him to merge the companies. The boy is shocked. He realizes his grandfather understands that Ain Motors is necessary if he wants to later take over Sang Motors. The chairman smiles faintly and asks how his grandson estimates the merger ratio. The young man asks why they should team up. The grandfather counters immediately, asking whether the boy truly believes he can protect Ain Motors on his own. In less than a year it would be swallowed by the Dion group. And even if not, could he really handle such an enemy? The boy smiles and says there is no need to worry. He has something to rely on. The chairman grows interested and wonders if that is true. He thinks that if his grandson is capable of managing Ain Motors properly, the merger might not even be necessary. The boy wants to warn him not to be so confident but realizes his impudence again. The chairman raises a finger and declares that everyone and everything can be sold. It is only a matter of price. Scales appear as the narration says that if balance is broken, it must be corrected. The chairman demands the merger coefficient. How much weight will the boy add to the scale? The young man calmly answers, 1.2. The grandfather erupts in anger. He says that by market share, brand value, and advanced production technology, Sang Motors is worth only 20% of Ain Motors. He says this is not his opinion, but the consensus of automotive industry professionals. The boy realizes his grandfather already knew this. The chairman covers his eyes and says that argument only concerns production. His grandson forgot the fundamentals. Share prices speak louder. Sang Motors shares are more than twice as expensive as Ain Motors shares because Sang also holds partner shares. Whoever acquires Sang Motors gains access to the Saying group itself. The boy understands. That is why he needs Ain Motors. The chairman crosses his arms and asks whether his grandson plans to place it on the scale. The boy's eyes sharpen with resolve. The grandfather smiles and comments on that expression. He relaxes back into his chair. It is revealed that during this conversation both of them exposed their secrets. Later, curiosity finally won. The chairman asked how Dijun made so much money. Dijun explained he sold inherited land and bonds, invested overseas, and rode a stock explosion. The old man noted that his fortune had grown 100-fold. When asked about fantasy investment, Dijun revealed he owned 98% and that Sean was the executive director. Chairman Jin was stunned. He realized his grandson had already built an empire. Dijun proposed returning the 100 billion won entrusted to him, with interest, in exchange for 7% of Ain Motors. His grandfather laughed, saying he could give him islands or jets if he wanted. Then he explained real rewards weren't money, but hope. He spoke of rewarding subordinates with luxury and illusion, making them believe effort would be paid back. Dijun recognized the tactic instantly. He had lived it before. Before leaving, his grandfather ordered him to stay hidden until Ain Motors was secured. Even Haki wouldn't know. Jun smiles. The young man and the old man lock eyes in silence. Yell folds his hands and turns to his grandson once more. He asks calmly what kind of wealth he actually owns. If he takes over Ain Motors, how much will he have left afterward? Jun chuckles. He says you should not dig directly into someone else's wallet like that. Then he adds casually that if the old man suddenly needed money, he could always borrow it from him. The room freezes. The old man stares at him in shock. Silence fills the living room. Yell suddenly stands up. He glares at the young man in anger. Vyun purses his lips, clearly thinking the boy has crossed the line. Then the old man walks forward. He places a hand on the hero's shoulder. He smiles. He says good job, calling him a kid, and adds that the young man has truly grown up. Jun looks at his grandfather with sparkling eyes. As they parted, the chairman told him to prepare accountants to dissect Ain Motors' books. Haki confirmed everything was ready. At the next meeting, doubts surfaced again. The chairman shut them down, demanding results within a week. Finally, he ordered a meeting with Ain Motors' chairman, saying he would go personally. Elsewhere, San smiled and asked if the talk went well. Dijun said he had full backing, and San should handle officials and shares. San asked why Dijun wouldn't appear himself. Dijun said no one trusted a child, especially one from a family with enemies everywhere. As plans accelerated, Dijun lay awake at night, haunted by memories of a gunshot from his past life. This time was different. He wasn't chasing comfort, he was chasing domination. He wanted to stand at the edge, even if the end was emptiness. When asked why he went quiet, Dijun turned away and said he'd remembered something. His grandfather added that once the shares were secured, the 100 billion won fund had to be returned. San asked cautiously if they could at least give back half. Dijun stood with his hands in his pockets and said he had already promised his grandfather. Since he chose to help, there was no other option. San asked whether Dijun had told him he was the main shareholder of Fantasy Investment. Dijun replied that of course he did, otherwise he wouldn't have asked for help. San pointed out that even as the main shareholder, Dijun was still returning all the money, calling it a missed chance to quietly keep 50 billion. Dijun replied that if his grandfather were that kind of man, Sang Group would have already belonged to his eldest uncle. San leaned back and muttered that the family was a nest of snakes. Elsewhere, tension filled the room as someone asked why everything felt so calm. A heavy-set man by the window said indirect evidence made subpoenas difficult. When asked why the press pressure was weak, everyone fell silent. Someone admitted it felt like Ain Motors was being protected. Hansung Daily was mentioned, and it turned out they hadn't written a single critical article. The leader sat back and asked if the rumors about marriage ties were real. Anger spread as it became clear everything was happening at once. Someone muttered that it looked like the old man was ready to sell even his grandson to stop the chaos. It was announced that Ain Motors had entered a government-led bankruptcy deferral agreement in April 1997. During the grace period, hidden slush funds quietly moved. The true mastermind was Chairman Ain, working through Fantasy. At Yang Chao's house, he smiled and asked whether Dijun's capital had really grown 100-fold. Sean felt awkward, knowing it was far more than that, and said it was mostly luck. Yang Chao called him modest and said he wished Sean worked for him. The discussion shifted to the hidden 270 billion won. Once the deferral expired, arrests would follow unless the money was removed first. Yang Chao smiled and asked directly if Sean was being asked to launder money. Sean hesitated but answered honestly. Dijun stepped in and suggested using the funds as retirement money for Ain Motors executives. Yang Chao laughed, saying those people had already prepared for old age. He proposed investing everything through Fantasy in America. Sean was stunned, asking if that was really all. Yang Chao nodded, explaining they could legally reinvest the money into Ain Motors as bonuses and incentives. Sean stared, realizing how clean the method was. Dijun noticed that his grandfather had already planned everything, ensuring the money never truly left his control. When Sean suggested executives would demand lump sums, Yang Chao scoffed, saying delaying payments created leverage. Money, he said, was both carrot and stick. He smiled coldly and said once they learned the funds were reinvested, they'd fight harder to protect Ain Motors. Dijun quietly sipped his tea, seeing his grandfather's true face. Dijun asked if this was the only reason the money wouldn't be returned. Yang Chao laughed, pretending offense at being called greedy. Yang Chao then said Dijun had to convince Mr. Song, while he'd handle the rest. Sean bowed and thanked him before leaving. Left alone, Yang Chao asked Dijun why he'd applied for sabbatical. Dijun admitted he did it that morning. Yang Chao ordered him to withdraw it immediately. When Dijun protested, the old man shut him down, saying he understood exactly what he was worried about. He explained that avoiding relatives while staying a student wouldn't work forever. When the fight began, titles wouldn't protect him. Yang Chao warned that Sang Group wasn't a playground and real power lay with branch presidents. If they backed the uncle, the group would split instantly. Dijun imagined that moment clearly. Once investigation started, power wouldn't pass to a student but to his uncle. He finally nodded and said he'd do everything his grandfather wanted. Yang Chao smiled, sensing where his grandson's loyalty lay. Later, riding in a green car, the driver said quietly that they were being followed. Dijun felt a chill and asked how long. The driver wasn't sure, but said Commander Shin had warned him about rising surveillance. Dijun exhaled and told him to test it. The driver accelerated, widening the gap. Dijun stayed calm, already guessing it was family. Curious what happens next? Tap that cheeky bell, subscribe, like and share.